Sections 4.1 to 4.3. These sections are all about the concept of interval, which is the distance between two notes. For example, in 4.1, we're given two notes and we need to circle the interval between them. In 4.2, we are similarly given two notes and we need to circle one of the 5 options there, which describe the quality of interval between the two notes. Lastly, in 4.3, we are given a bass note and the interval name, and we are required to write the note above the given note to match the given interval. To do these questions, we need to know what interval names are in a major scale. Let's take F major as an example. The first two notes in the F major scale is always called the major second, and then between the first and the third note, in this case an F and A, is always called the major third. And then we have the first and the fourth note, in this case the F and the B flat, is called the perfect fourth. And we have the first and the fifth note, which is called the perfect fifth, and the first and the sixth note, the major sixth, and the first and the seventh note, the major seventh, and lastly we have the octave, which is simply called the perfect octave. Beyond the octave, we also have other intervals, which are somewhat similar to the ones that we have gone through, but with some slight adjustment. For the first pair, the F and the G at the higher octave, we still call the distance between them a major second, but now we add the word compound before it, so that it becomes compound major second. Alternatively, we can also call it by its exact number of interval, so in this case a major ninth, which is just one step above the perfect octave. For the next pair, we have F and the higher octave A. Similarly, we call that a major third, but we add the word compound again, so that it becomes a compound major third. Or we can also call it a major tenth, which is one step above the major ninth. And the same logic applies. The next pair is an F and a B flat at the top, which in this case becomes a compound perfect fourth, which can also be called a perfect 11th. And following that, we have the compound perfect fifth, or the perfect 12th. And next, the compound major 6th, or the major 13th. And the compound major 7th, or the major 14th. And lastly, the compound perfect octave, or the perfect 15th. By now, you notice that the number for the intervals within an octave and beyond the octave always have a difference of 7. So for example, a major ninth minus 7 becomes a major second, and then major 10th minus 7 is the major third, and the perfect 11th minus 7 is the perfect fourth, the perfect 12th minus 7 is the perfect fifth, and the major 13th minus 7 is the major sixth, and so on and so on. So as a summary, interval is the distance between two notes, and second, for the intervals of 4th, 5th and 8th, they are always called perfects, whereas the remaining ones, that is the 2nd, 3rd, 6th and 7th, they are always called major. Lastly, if the notes are more than one octave, we either add the word compound before it, or we use the +7 method when naming them. Apart from intervals that fall within the major scale, we also have variants of these intervals, because in real music there can be accidentals that change the original distance between the two notes. Let's start with an example of a major third. To help ourselves do this better, we'll take out the key signature grid and our little keyboard. In this case, we're dealing with the key of D major, because the bottom note in this example is a D. And looking at the key signature grid, in D major we have F sharp and C sharp, and that makes it a correct major third in this case, the D and the F sharp. Now, there are ways we can change the distance between these notes. For example, we can reduce the top note by one semitone so that it becomes a D and F natural. And in this case, it effectively becomes a minor third interval. Furthermore, we can reduce the distance between a minor third by yet another semitone. So in this case, we can add a flat to the top note, and so that it becomes a D and F flat, which effectively becomes a diminished third interval. And these are the variants of the original interval. Apart from changing the top note, we can also do something to the bottom note to reduce the interval between the original major third. So from a D and F sharp, we can add a sharp to the bottom note so that it becomes a D sharp. And in this case, the distance between the two notes is similarly one semitone less because the bottom note has been raised by one semitone and the distance between the two notes has been squeezed. And in this case, it's also called a minor third. And the same logic applies. We can add another sharp to the bottom note so that it becomes a D double sharp. And in this case, a D double sharp and an F sharp on top is also called a diminished third interval. On the other hand, we can increase the distance between the two notes. For example, we raise the top note, the F sharp, by one semitone to become an F double sharp. In this case, we call that an augmented third. Alternatively, we can also achieve the same by lowering the bottom note so that it becomes a D flat and an F sharp above, and that's also called an augmented third interval. So as a summary, and this applies to all the major intervals including the third that we use in this example, as well as the second, the sixth, and the seventh. When the distance between the two notes has been increased by one semitone, we call it an augmented interval. And if it's reduced by one semitone, it's a minor interval. And if it's reduced by two semitones, we call them diminished intervals. Now for the perfect intervals, we follow a slightly different system. In this case, let's use the perfect fifth as an example. Here we have the B flat in the bass, so we need to think in terms of a B flat major scale. According to the key signature grid, in B flat major scale, we only have a B flat and an E flat. So in this case, the perfect fifth is correct because in a B flat major scale, the fifth note is an F, not anything else. Now, if we change the distance between them, for example, by lowering the top note into a F flat, that will become a diminished fifth because the distance between the two notes will have been reduced by one semitone. Similarly, we can also achieve the same by raising the bottom note by one semitone so that it becomes a B natural, and that also makes it a diminished fifth interval. On the other hand, we can increase the distance between the two notes by adding a sharp to the top note so that it becomes a B flat in the bass and F sharp at the top, and that we call an augmented fifth. Alternatively, we can also just keep the top note as it is and lower the bottom note by one semitone to become a B double flat, and in this case it's also called an augmented fifth. In summary, for any perfect intervals, such as the fifth in this case, and the fourth and octave intervals, which are also perfect, we follow essentially the same naming system, except that we no longer have the minor interval, as in the examples of the major intervals. In other words, whenever the distance between a perfect interval is reduced by one semitone, we immediately call it a diminished interval already. We don't call it a minor. Now that we have learned about how to name intervals, we can return to these questions. Let's take out our key signature grid and the keyboard. For the first question, we have a G note in the bass and a D flat at the top. Now let's check the key of G major. Does it have any D flat or D sharp? Well, not really, as it only has an F sharp. So in this case, the D, being the fifth note of a G major scale, so G, A, B, C, D, 5 steps, is a fifth interval. And normally in a G major scale, the perfect fifth would have been a D natural. But the fact that it's now a D flat makes it one semitone less between the two notes. And so in this case, the perfect fifth becomes a diminished fifth. And that is the answer. In the second question, we have an F sharp in the bass and an E flat at the top. First, we need to figure out the interval number. Which degree is the note E flat in the key of F sharp major? Well, we can simply do that by counting the letter names. So if F is 1, G is 2, then A will be the third, B is the fourth, C is the fifth, D is the sixth, and E is the seventh. So F sharp and E flat is the interval of a seventh. And now we have to determine if this E flat falls within the F sharp major scale. And if we look at the key signature grid, F sharp major scale has F, C, G, D, and A, E sharps. So for the 7th to be a major interval, we need to have an F sharp in the bass and E sharp at the top. But this isn't the case here because we have an E flat. And now let's consider how many semitones have been reduced from the E sharp. So from E sharp we go down by one semitone, which becomes an E natural, and we go down by yet another semitone, which becomes an E flat. So in this case, the distance between a major 7th has been reduced by 2 semitones, and that becomes a diminished 7th interval. And so this is the answer. Lastly, in question 4.3, we are given the bass note of a C, and we need to write the augmented 12 above it. To make it easier, I tend to convert these intervals back to the compound version. So in this case, 12 minus the number 7 becomes a 5th. So in other words, it becomes a compound augmented 5th interval. Now, in order to find out what an augmented 5th is, first we need to think about what a perfect 5th is. So in this case, given that we have a very simple key signature of C major, we don't really need to worry about any sharp or flat at this stage, because the perfect 5th in a C major scale will be the G. So from C, D, E, F to G, 5 steps. And so we can just put a G here, bearing in mind that it's a higher octave G because we're now working with the compound interval. And then, because it's an augmented 5th, we simply raise the top note so that we increase the distance between the two notes by one semitone, and that becomes a G sharp. And this is how we answer this question. In summary, when dealing with questions relating to intervals, we need to follow 3 important steps. Step 1. We always count from the bottom note to determine the interval number. Is it a 4th or is it a 5th? And we do that by counting the letter names. Step 2. If the top note belongs to the major scale of the bottom note, then the interval will be either a major or perfect. Step 3. If the top note does not belong to the major scale of the bottom note, then the interval will be either diminished, minor, or augmented, depending on the adjusted distance between the two notes. That is, how many semitones it has been reduced or increased by. And that's how you handle these sections. Interval is one of the more difficult topics in music theory because it builds on your knowledge of key signature and scales. But as always, practice makes perfect. The more exercises you do, the better you will internalize these steps when finding intervals. If you're looking for some more practice, I'll highly recommend that you visit this interactive site where I've put together a lot of practice tests and mock papers with instant feedback. In the drill mode, you'll have access to all the questions section by section, so that you can focus on specific question types and practice them until you feel confident. There are virtually unlimited questions. In the exam mode, you have access to full papers in the exact format of the exam, with randomized questions each time. You have 2 hours to finish the complete paper, at the end of which you'll be given your score and feedback.